welcome to Health Issues. I'm your host, Sylvain, and I am excited about this show. I really, really am. We have been focusing on schools, and we have a great guest from Education Research Alliance. We have Dr. Jane Lincove. Welcome, Doctor. How are you today?
Thank you.
Well, excited to have you. Right out of USC Trojans, am I right?
Yes.
PhD from USC and a master's in UCLA. I think a lot of people are envious.
Of our football?
No, it's good stuff. But really, in public policy, but you're working with tell us about the group, Research Alliance.
Our organization is the Education Research Alliance for New Orleans, and we're housed at Tulane University. We are a research center, an academic research center. We do interdisciplinary research focused on education in New Orleans. There are many education policy centers at universities. We're kind of unique because we're focused on New Orleans and the school reforms and the things going on with public schools and public school students here.
Explain that. You said it's kind of unique.
So first of all, because we are focused on the city and its students and its families, and providing rigorous academic research that informs policy here. So we are academics and we're doing academic research, but we are trying as hard as we can to make it policy relevant, to involve local stakeholders, leaders, and students and families as well, in generating the questions that we answer, and in discussing our research in a way that can inform improvements for students, improvements for schools, policy changes, management of the education system here. So
basically, you're compiling the true data, scientifically rigorous,
yes.
As strong as it can be to allow, and then feeding it to the so-called policymakers so that in digestible bites that they can understand.
Yeah, one thing about the debate here is a lot of people have a little bit of statistics. So there are many people who come out very strongly on one side of being pro-school reform or anti-school reform, and they both have statistics, and they both have powerful, moving statistics that say that students are doing better or students are not doing better. So what we're trying to do is do kind of a higher level of both quantitative and qualitative analysis, the kind that you would do in academic research, where you would really ask, like, what are the effects of this program? Are these the effects of the program, or are they the effects of something else? To really isolate the effects of what's going on in the school system, separate from things like neighborhood effects, family effects, student sorting, things like that. To really see how the changes that have been made are affecting students, so that when people have a conversation about what should be done, whether the one app is a good idea, whether it's fair or unfair, that we can say, well, we've looked at these groups of students, we've looked at how they interact with the one app and what happened to them as a result. And that's really our objective, is not to tell people what direction this should go in, but to bring really useful information that's rigorous, that's been reviewed by lots of researchers and lots of different points of view.
It's almost like a scientific journal.
Our personal, professional objective is to publish this in scientific journals so that our community of academics can learn from what's going on here. But it's not fair to do that in a way where we're not including the community. And it's in the end, much more useful if people from New Orleans, if schools understand what we're doing, if the research questions are coming from local stakeholders.
But the quality of it would be publishable.
That's our goal, yeah, that the quality is publishable. We have a tension in doing this kind of applied work because the community wants results quickly. Like, they want to know, well, we just did the one app, so did it work? Whereas we would say, give us 10 years and we'll tell you. So, so we definitely have a challenge to balance our very slow academic research production process, getting our results into academic journals and the scientific community, and the desire to have feedback quickly enough so that you can make meaningful change. But our focus is on that slow process of producing rigorous academic research.
I love it. I'm excited about it all the way around, because particularly, and hey, that's your area of public policy. As you say, people are able to grab bits of information and spin it, so to speak. Well, but let's even deal with that, though. This concept, particularly with schools, we see a whole lot of it. How do you protect your research Is there a part of your research where you're saying don't spin our research?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we have conversations a lot about things that academics don't usually talk about, things like how do we control the message? We are learning, we're kind of navigating the process of making sure that our results are clear, at the same time having it be statistically rigorous in a way that we might not be able to explain to a school teacher, for example. But really, that's our job, and that's the challenge that we've taken upon ourselves. We have a lot of postdocs who've come straight from their academic training, and what we're really trying to do is get them out there in front of stakeholders, have them talk about their research, have stakeholders say, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right. We have an advisory board of stakeholders, and we really ask them to challenge us on what we're saying. Like, if you don't know what we're talking about, right, tell us, I don't know what you're talking about. Right. And then they really challenge us to go back to the data and make sure it says what it really says in a way that, and we need to communicate it in a way that can be delivered. Now, I mean, there are lots of people who will spin academic research the way they want to. We hope that it's more difficult to spin rigorous academic research in one direction than it is just statistics. So.
Well, I think it happens in every field, but maintaining the quality and the integrity of the research, it's got to be a locked box as best as possible, because it's never perfect, but at least it has to be some level. And usually scientific journals become almost like the gateway to the rest of the world, but you're using a different gateway. Yeah,
I mean, we've used those. We publish shorter policy briefs for the community here who doesn't want to read a 50-page academic paper. One thing we try to do in those is say, what these results tell us about what's going on. We also usually have a section called What the Results Don't Say, which is to anticipate how people might misinterpret it, particularly for outside of New Orleans. Like, a lot of people look at New Orleans and say, we want to do this in our city, and we try to be really cautious to say, you have to understand New Orleans to understand what's working and not working here. Then you want to think about whether you want to replicate this or imitate it in another city.
I see why we were referred to you guys.
Oh, thank you.
I can see why. Yeah, literally, because other groups are using your data.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different story. But okay, let's even look at some of the data. Okay, and before we even start, not me, but I think many people are understanding that we have two different school systems going on. We have historically within the United States, it's just the way it is in economics, politics, and everything else like that. The numbers for the African Americans don't necessarily apply for the other races. And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's very typical in an urban system to see inequality in the quality within the public schools. And this can be the difference between suburban schools that are mostly white and wealthier and urban schools. It can also, within a school district, I moved from Austin, Texas, and the school district in Austin, Texas, even within the public schools, you see a geographic difference based on historic segregation patterns in the city of the quality of schools. So there's a freeway that divides the city, and people will say, like, oh, west of the freeway are the good schools, and east of the freeway are the schools that aren't so good. And you can see that historically there's been an underinvestment in the schools on the east side, and that's also where the minorities live, and that's not a coincidence. In New Orleans, it's more complicated because the system we have now isn't geographic. But even before, when there was a geographic system, there was still a big difference in New Orleans, because New Orleans is also a city where the white families typically were going to private schools, as well as wealthier black families. And so you ended up with these different tiers, not just within the public school system, but you have a private school system that's frequently the default for higher income families. And then you have the public schools, and within the public schools you have selective admission schools that get to choose their students with different missions and different objectives. And then you have the open enrollment schools, which accept students from the lottery system. But even within the open enrollment system, you can have schools with kind of different strategies for attracting a different type of student. So it's much more complicated here than other areas where it's just like, oh, you live in that neighborhood, which means you're probably a minority, which means you're probably going to a low quality school.
Makes it difficult for a researcher.
Yeah, but very interesting. Like all of us who moved here to work for ERA, and we have 10 researchers who moved here for this, moved here because we're really interested in the challenge of what's going on here. It is a model that is an extreme example of what's going on in lots of other school districts that we've worked with. So, you know, Detroit, DC, Houston, LA, Denver are all examples of cities that do this to some extent, that have some sense of school choice, that have some sense of kind of breaking down the barriers of neighborhoods, and hopefully allowing students to have access to schools they didn't have access to before. But in New Orleans, it's like exploded. I mean, this is like the extreme. This is the dream that school reformers have. So they're going to look to New Orleans and say, like, finally a city is doing what we want every city to do. And it's really important to stop and say, like, what is actually happening when you do this? Not all interventions work well, and not all our interventions should be taken to citywide scale. So.
Now, you had mentioned, I'd asked earlier, something you guys are working on. All right, we tease out the data for the African Americans, but then to tease out the data for African American males.
Yeah, so teasing out the data is one of our next steps. The big results that we have released so far as part of our conference for the 10th anniversary of Katrina had to do with kind of average effects of the reform. Now, because the population in New Orleans public schools is so heavily Black and low income, you can't have results unless you have results for that population. So the next step is to examine subgroups, and in particular subgroups where we see in national data, like in the NAEP data, which is the national kind of standardized test of student achievement that's given in every state by the federal government. In that data, we see achievement gaps in Louisiana and the same achievement gaps in New Orleans as we see in Louisiana. And so you would want to look at the groups of students. And in New Orleans in particular, I think it's low-income Black males, where you see the biggest gap between those students and students from the same neighborhood but with different demographics, and lower graduation rates, lower opportunities to go to college. So really kind of your long-term meaningful outcomes. I agree that I think that's a group that needs particular emphasis. I can't tell you how they're doing now because, again, we have a slow research process, but it's definitely part of our plan. We're also looking at special ed students because in a choice system, they may be like the least likely to be well paired with a program that serves their needs. And so that's another group that we're particularly concerned with.
Now, one of the big things looking at the research, all right, we have 100,000 folks that did not come back, African Americans, after Katrina.
Yeah.
Can we actually have good comparable data if we don't know who those 100,000 were? I mean, it's been speculation that they were lower income. Those would be the ones that would automatically, without having them, the data has to fly up, regardless of the income and the extra. And
that's one of the things that my colleagues Matt Larson and Doug Harris looked at when they were looking at the average effects of the reform. What they did was they looked at the students who returned. We have data going back before the storm. So we could actually look at a cohort of students who were here and take the ones who's returned and make some efforts to describe and control for which students didn't return. And their results say that the positive effects are not explained by students not coming back. That the students who came back and the students who didn't start taking tests until after the storm, so they would have been in third grade when they came back, that they're doing better than they would be in another system, or than comparable students who aren't in New Orleans. So we do it by comparing who did come back with students who are like those students, instead of comparing just the average test scores before and after.
That's good, but and that's good to know, and did not know that. But the second part obviously would be that would there be a way to control for, say, like if the kid was a disruptor, and so the disruptor's not there. So obviously, if the disruptor's not there, so that you might have different peer. We would call it peer effects. That you had different peer effects. No, and that's a really interesting question. I think I'm going to bring that back to them and see. We can't know in our data who was the disruptor. True.
We don't observe that, but we can kind of see if like how the average student that you were with changed over time, and that's a very interesting question. One of the things that's, again, interesting in the pre and post comparison is that in recent years we're seeing more white students in the public schools due to the creation of some models that are kind of designed to bring those students back into the system. And then it becomes a really interesting question what the peer effects are. Whether part of the theory behind it is that if these families who can afford to send their kids to private schools but really would prefer to be in public schools, and can see that there's a public school that would fit for their students, does bringing those students back in improve the system? So is that positive peer effects for the students who can't afford to leave the public school system? Do those parents, volunteer more? Do they make a stronger school community and things like that?
It's the whole concept of busing.
Yeah, but once again, you can't. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. You can't compare that with before the storm because those students weren't there. So you really have to, and you can't just look at averages because those students may be increasing the average, but they're not the student that you really are concerned with, that you want to focus on.
Well, overall, obviously, okay, again, and you said it very succinctly that there have been improvements. So the same students have been able to improve. But again, without the is there any way to know would those changes have been able to occur with the same school structure without firing 7,000 teachers and so forth and so on?
That's what we can't know. What we like in science is to change one thing at a time.
Okay.
Right? So you want everything exactly the same. It's called control.
All right.
And then you change one thing. And when a school district does everything at once, when they lay off the teachers and they take away geographic attendance zones and they decentralize the schools to charters and add test-based accountability and other levels of accountability, then what we can't know is which one was it. So we're doing kind of individual studies to tease out like what happened with the teachers. Do schools that have different teacher hiring strategies perform differently with the same type of student? But unfortunately, because what happened in New Orleans was not an experiment in a scientific sense, it is difficult to give advice on which component worked. Like, is it just school choice or is it
money? The enormous amount of foundation money that came in.
Absolutely, a lot of things happened at the same time. Yeah.
I am so excited. I could not be more. I've been screaming this that we don't know.
Yeah.
There's too many things to not know. Let's bring it into policy, and which may not be error, but your policy area. When we take again things that we know something happened. Okay, so what? But if we don't know what caused it, to create that as a model for another city, what are we doing?
Right, absolutely. And it, as somebody who does this type of research, I very rarely say that I know. And it's always surprising to me when people can come out so strongly for or against what's going on. And then there are always people who are like, but my kid is doing terribly, or but my kid is doing very well. And that's really important information in the system, and you can't just react to a statistic of, more students pass the test and so it's working. That really oversimplifies what's going on in a situation like this. But if you just the history of public education since Brown versus Board of Education has been, it's a process of reform, and it's a process of testing things and trying them, and the system has never been stable and the same. The general model that there is like a school district and they operate all the schools, which New Orleans has left, was a model that was accepted, but it's not like people haven't been trying to integrate schools and people haven't been trying to teach differently or adjust the curriculum or do different things with teachers. So it's not new that there would be this type of reform. So what we need is for people to think about it as kind of a long evolution in trying to improve the schools. And New Orleans took a big step all at once, but understanding whether it works takes a long time. You need a generation of students before you can actually say how this is different than going through a more traditional school system.
The value of a good PhD. I'll say it over and over.
My professors would thank you for that.
No, I would say it over and over and over again. To look at the data and to do proper research. It's never perfect, but it can give intelligent decisions. As far as the things that's going on. Something I want to throw out. This idea of if the standards have changed, improvement becomes meaningless. I mean standards of I've heard the attack or comment that What's happened is that what was so-called average is not average anymore. They had to move the needle of what average was. So now when they say that we don't have any failing schools, it's only because they've changed the definitions have changed to whereas, again, scientifically, how are we really saying that improvement has happened or at that same rate?
Yeah, I mean, in any district and in Louisiana and New Orleans as well, if you're going to use things like a school report card grade,
right,
you really need to understand what goes into the grade and what goes into the grade changes over time. Like, you might not be able to compare a B school from 10 years ago with a B school from today. I don't think the change that Louisiana made is quite as drastic as people say it is. I came from Texas where they changed all the time. So those were more drastic changes. There's a benefit to simplifying information for parents so that they know, oh, it's an A school, that's better than a B school. I'm not sure how they decided that, but I know that somebody thinks it's better than the B school. The trade-off there is that you lose a lot of information as well, and you lose kind of all the nuance that would tell parents, like, oh, this is why this school is better. The parent who wants to dig into that data, it really should be transparent and clear how you got to that grade. Some states have a very complicated grading system. New Orleans it can be understood, the one that Louisiana uses. But again, even in my center with a bunch of PhDs, we had a 2-hour lunch where we discussed how an SPS score is made and how it might change and how this changed over time. So you shouldn't have to have a PhD to be able to consume data on schools. What I would prefer is that people look at least at a combination of passing rates and growth. Because schools, some schools get students who can pass, and they don't have to try very hard. And their outcomes should be focused on other things. So if you have a group of students where when they come in kindergarten, you're like, yeah, these, they have great resources at home, they came to school ready to learn, most of them can already read, they're gonna do fine on the 3rd grade reading test. Other schools get a lot of churn, and they, at the beginning of the year, might have 30% 3rd graders who weren't even at their school last year who have very low reading skills. And for them, they might do a ton to get these kids close to passing, right? But not actually passing. So you want to look at a combination. It's important to pass. That's what parents care about. They want their kids to pass and move on to the next grade. So you want to look at a combination of the two. And I think when you can merge that together so that parents can see both, like, this is the average type of student who goes to this school, and this is how much 3rd graders improved from 3rd grade to 4th grade and from 4th grade to 5th grade. And to have it be the cohort of students and not this year's 3rd graders are doing so much better than last year's 3rd graders. Like, but they might be very different types of students. And so you just want to know that your kid is going to learn, that if your kid comes in as with needing remediation to read, by the end of the year he might not need remediation anymore. And we can show that with test score growth data. I would like a little more of that in the mix. But I kind of trust parents to be able to kind of dig in and figure out what their kid needs. And I think if you provide an array of information to parents, that they can dig in and find out.
Well, 2 questions. Let's start with this. All right, overall, again, looking at the school systems, we've had improvement, but are we moving to, we don't know, but are we moving to a place where these students are, particularly the African-American students, where we're moving to levels of proficiency, particularly, I'm looking at ACT scores and so forth. I'm still seeing 16s and 18s, the type of numbers that wouldn't get in anybody's college, for the most part. Are we still bouncing around in areas that, whether it is good or bad, we're not doing anything to move the needle to the point where we can be economically viable as a people?
Yeah, I think a lot more needs to be done. I don't have, again, we've just started looking at things like dropout statistics and graduation and college access. We just recently got that data, whereas we've had this lower grade test score data for a long time. So we can say more about the lower grade test scores improving. Those should be associated with better outcomes later for those kids, but not if there's high dropout rates. Not if there aren't programs to encourage students to apply to college and things like that. So it really needs to, the basic literacy is the start, but a lot more needs to be done in order to kind of fill at the higher grades and make sure everybody has opportunities to go to college.
Okay, economics, obviously, New Orleans is a poor city, just poor, particularly in the African American sector, all the way around. But is any of that data teased out as far as for economics and you know, test scores or just advancement?
We don't have, not yet for us. Yeah, no, I mean, the hope is that we can start tracing cohorts of students and we can see how they did, how they entered high school, how they performed in high school, where they went to college and things like that. Louisiana has gotten access to data on college enrollment so that we can kind of see, even if people are leaving the state of Louisiana, what we really want is to see if they complete college, because getting access and then not completing can be kind of a waste of resources for students as well. Like, you know, it's worse to start college and not finish financially than it is to postpone it, for example. But we don't know yet. From a data standpoint, we don't know yet, but I agree that those are the things that are like the real concern of the education system, is what are the economic opportunities for these students. Okay,
but you hear the news and so forth that people are using taking a whole lot of maybe ifs, I don't knows, and we need to do more research, and they're saying we've changed the world. I mean, is there anything we can do, anything that you guys can do data-wise to say stop saying that?
Yeah, I think the most important thing will be to dig into the dropout data, dropout and graduation, and see if this is really leading to more students graduating, finishing the public education system, ready to go and be successful at college.
Yeah, because that's where the New York Times article dealt with as far as for training people for the tests. You know, you know, so we have great test takers, but what does that have to do with somebody, you know, with a job or anything else like that?
Yeah, nobody shows up at a job interview with their 6th grade score.
Yeah, so what? You know what I mean? Big deal. That doesn't mean they can think critically or have the confidence to operate in the world.
Yeah, and again, a lot of things are changing at the same time. So the students are taking the PARCC test now, and the PARCC test is meant to test more of these critical thinking, higher order skills that are going to be more indicative of the things that you need to do to be successful in the long run. But we don't know that yet, because this last year was the first year the kids took the PARCC test. So we have it aspires to be that, but we don't know yet.
Okay, good. Some of the in the data, and you've looked at it around the country. African American kids, what's working? Is there any programs that's working per se that for the African American kids particularly?
I'm most familiar from my research focus on college access. And I've done a lot of research with some colleagues in Texas on college access. And Texas has a large Latino population and a smaller African American population. And they were concerned about low minority enrollment in college, which they should be, particularly because the state is in the public school system, and in the future the entire state is majority minority. So if only white students are going to college, the state is failing most of its students. And they have been incredibly successful with black students applying to college, like just increasing that they're thinking that they're going to go to college, and increasing the application also increases enrollment.
I got to cut off. This is awesome. We're going to continue this another time. We'll have her back. Real research, speaking the truth. Come on, let's make it happen. Stop lying.